Welcome to another enchanting tale as we embark on a journey into the magical land of Sylveron. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the soothing whispers of the night guide you into a peaceful slumber. Tonight, we will meet a wise wizard named Calyx, who guards a powerful artifact known as the Cloak of Veils. This mystical cloak, woven from threads of moonlight and shadow, holds the balance of magic in Sylveron, ensuring that peace reigns across the kingdom. But as with all great tales, shadows gather, and a dark presence stirs, seeking to disrupt the harmony of this enchanted realm. So snuggle in, let the warmth of your blankets envelop you, and allow your mind to drift into the soothing story of Calyx and the fate of the Cloak of Veils. Sweet dreams await. In the heart of Sylveron, where the skies forever shimmered with hues of gold and sapphire, there lived a wizard named Calyx. His tower, nestled at the edge of the enchanted forest, stood tall and proud, its stone walls entwined with vines of silver ivy. Calyx was a figure of mystery, known for his unmatched mastery of magic. But what set him apart from others of his kind was the ancient artifact he guarded. A cloak woven from threads of moonlight and shadow. It was called the Cloak of Veils, and its powers were the stuff of legend. The cloak could render its wearer completely invisible, but it was not merely a tool of concealment. It held within it the balance of magic in Sylveron, a delicate equilibrium that ensured peace reigned in the land. For generations, the cloak had passed from one wizard to the next, each sworn to protect it from those who might seek to misuse its power. Calyx, though powerful and wise, was humble. He knew that the cloak's magic was both a blessing and a curse. It offered great protection to the kingdom, but it also invited the darkest of desires in the hearts of men. The temptation of invisibility, the allure of unseen power, could corrupt even the purest soul. And so Calyx kept it hidden, locked away in the highest chamber of his tower, guarded by spells only he could unravel. One autumn evening, the king of Sylveron himself came to visit the wizard. The air was crisp, and the golden leaves of the forest swirled in the wind as the king approached Calyx's tower, his heart heavy with the troubles of his kingdom. The crops had failed, the rivers had run low, and whispers of unrest were spreading through the villages. The king, desperate for guidance, sought the wisdom of Calyx. The wizard welcomed the king with open arms, guiding him into the warmth of his study. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows upon shelves lined with ancient tomes and potions that shimmered with otherworldly colors. "My friend," the king said, his voice low and filled with weariness, "I have come seeking your counsel. The kingdom is in peril, and I fear that soon, even I will not be able to hold it together." Calyx nodded gravely, his wise eyes studying the troubled ruler. He knew of the hardships plaguing the land, and he had sensed a shift in the balance of magic that governed Sylveron. "I can offer you advice, and I can lend you my knowledge," Calyx replied, his voice calm but laden with an understanding of the weight of his words. "But there is something more I must show you, something that has long been hidden from the eyes of men." The king looked at the wizard curiously as Calyx rose from his chair and led him up a narrow, winding staircase. The air grew cooler as they ascended, and the light from the fire below faded, replaced by the soft glow of enchanted lanterns that lined the stone walls. At last, they reached the highest chamber, and there, behind a door sealed with intricate runes, lay the Cloak of Veils. The wizard carefully unlatched the door and stepped aside, allowing the king to gaze upon the cloak for the first time. It shimmered like the night sky, a dark fabric woven with threads of silver that seemed to ripple like water. The king's breath caught in his throat as he beheld its beauty. But it was not merely the cloak's appearance that struck him. It was the palpable sense of power emanating from it, a force that seemed to hum with the very essence of magic. "This," Calyx said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "is the Cloak of Veils. It has the power to render its wearer invisible, but it is also the key to maintaining the balance of magic in our world. Without it, chaos would reign." The king, awestruck, stepped back. "Such a thing," he murmured, "should never fall into the wrong hands." Calyx nodded. "That is why I guard it so closely, and why it must remain hidden. But know this, my king, the cloak is not just a relic of power. It is a symbol of trust between those who wield magic and those who rule. I show it to you now as a sign of my faith in you, that you will never seek it for your own gain." The king bowed his head, humbled by the wizard's words. Little did they both know as they spoke that in the shadows of the forest, another had been watching, waiting for the moment to strike. And so, the story of the Cloak of Veils began, with the trust that would soon be broken and a balance that would be shattered. Far beyond the warmth of the wizard's tower, where the golden leaves of Sylveron's forests whispered secrets to the night, a darker presence stirred. In the stillness of twilight, a figure crouched, hidden among the twisted roots and ancient trees. His name was Veric, a cunning thief known for his wiles and his hunger for power. Veric had heard tales of the Cloak of Veils, passed down from generation to generation, its legend growing with each retelling. And now, he had come to claim it for himself. Veric was no ordinary thief. His skill with dark magic, learned in secrecy and shadow, had made him feared across the land. Where others saw a kingdom of peace, he saw a land ripe for manipulation. Where others revered Calyx as a protector, Veric saw a gatekeeper to power. And behind that gate was the cloak, the key to his ambition. The night of the king's visit was Veric's moment. From his hidden vantage point at the edge of the forest, he had watched the wizard and the king ascend the tower. He had seen the flickering lanterns, the brief opening of the door to the highest chamber, and the faint shimmer of something too powerful to remain hidden. His sharp eyes, accustomed to the darkness, had caught the gleam of the Cloak of Veils. The wizard's careful protection only fueled Varric's determination. If he could possess the cloak, he could become invisible, unknowable, and use that power to control the kingdom from the shadows. As the moon rose higher, casting long beams of silver light through the treetops, Varric made his move. The tower stood tall, its stone walls enchanted to deter any who might wish harm upon its inhabitant. But Varric had studied the wizard's magic, and he had prepared. With him, he carried a vial of black liquid, distilled from the poisonous nightshade vine, known to unravel enchantments if used correctly. A single drop was all it took. Varric approached the tower's base, his movements swift and silent. The ivy-covered walls hummed with magic, ancient and potent, but with careful precision, Varric uncorked the vial and let a drop fall onto the ground. The vines recoiled as if in pain, slithering back to reveal a narrow gap just large enough for him to slip through. A grin spread across the thief's face. The wizard's protection, while strong, was no match for Varric's dark arts. Inside the tower, the night was still. Calyx, confident in his wards, slept soundly in the chamber below, unaware of the danger creeping into his domain. Varric's footsteps were barely a whisper as he ascended the spiral staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The shadows danced along the walls, hiding him from the enchanted lanterns that flickered dimly above. At last, Varric reached the highest chamber. The door stood before him, sealed with ancient runes and glowing faintly in the moonlight. This was no ordinary lock, but Varric had come prepared. He pulled a small, jagged stone from his cloak, a piece of obsidian, enchanted with magic as old as the runes themselves. With a single touch, the stone absorbed the glow from the door's protection, snuffing out the spell as easily as one might extinguish a candle. The door creaked open. Inside, the Cloak of Veils hung as if suspended in mid-air, its silvery threads shifting like water in the moonlight. Varric's breath caught in his throat. It was more magnificent than he had imagined, more powerful than he had dreamed. Carefully, with trembling hands, he reached out and lifted the cloak from its invisible perch. The fabric felt cool to the touch, like holding a piece of the night itself. As he draped it over his shoulders, Varric's body faded into nothingness. He was invisible. A rush of power surged through him. This was what he had craved, true freedom, untethered by the laws of men. The kingdom would never see him coming. Without a sound, Varric slipped back down the staircase and out into the night, leaving no trace of his presence. The wizard slept on, unaware that the balance of Sylveron had been shattered in a single, silent moment. And so, the cloak was stolen, and with it, the fate of the kingdom hung in the balance. Varric disappeared into the shadows, but the consequences of his theft were about to ripple through the land. Darkness had been unleashed, and soon all of Sylveron would feel its weight. The sun rose over Sylveron, casting its golden light across the kingdom, but the brightness did little to dispel the growing unease. In the village square, merchants set up their stalls, farmers carried their goods to market, and children ran through the streets, their laughter filling the air. Yet something felt different. There was a heaviness that hung over the kingdom, a whisper of unease that no one could name but all could feel. At the wizard's tower, Calyx awoke with a start. The air in his chamber was cold, colder than it should have been. His mind, always attuned to the subtle shifts of magic, sensed something was wrong. He rose from his bed and ascended the spiral staircase to the highest chamber. His heart quickened as he reached the door. It stood ajar, a sight that filled him with dread. Pushing it open, Calyx stepped inside and froze. The Cloak of Veils was gone. For a moment, the wizard stood in stunned silence, his mind racing. How had this happened? His wards were strong, his spells impenetrable. And yet someone, somehow, had broken through. The realization hit him like a blow. The cloak, the key to Sylveron's balance, was in the hands of a thief. Panic surged in his chest, but Calyx was not one to succumb to fear. He closed his eyes and muttered an incantation, searching the tower for any lingering trace of the intruder. There, faint but unmistakable, he sensed it. The residue of dark magic, creeping like a shadow through the air. Whoever had stolen the cloak had used powerful spells, dangerous ones. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. This was no ordinary theft. This was the work of someone who understood the true power of the cloak and intended to use it. Meanwhile, in the kingdom, strange things began to happen. Small at first, objects disappearing, doors found unlocked, whispers heard in empty rooms. Then the rumors began. A merchant in the marketplace swore he had seen a bag of gold vanish from his stall, as if snatched by an unseen hand. A noblewoman claimed her prized necklace had been stolen from her bedside, though no one had entered her chamber. The invisible thief became the talk of the town. It didn't take long for these strange occurrences to reach the king's ears. Sitting upon his throne in the grand hall, the king listened to the reports with growing concern. Though the tales seemed like fanciful rumors, the king knew that something darker was at play. He sent word to Calyx, summoning the wizard to the palace at once. Calyx arrived, his face grave. He stood before the king, his heart heavy with the burden of what he had to reveal. "My lord," the wizard began, his voice low and filled with regret. "The Cloak of Veils has been stolen." The king's eyes widened, and a hush fell over the court. "Stolen? How could such a thing happen? I do not yet know the full answer, Calyx replied, but the thief has used dark magic to breach my defenses. Worse still, the cloak's power is already at work. The kingdom is at risk. If we do not recover it soon, Sylveron will fall into chaos. The king stood from his throne, pacing the marble floor, his brow furrowed in thought. This invisible thief, he must be stopped. But how can we catch a man we cannot see? That, Calyx said, his eyes filled with determination, is the challenge before us. We must act swiftly, or the cloak's power will be used to tear this kingdom apart. News of the theft spread like wildfire. The people of Sylveron grew fearful, knowing that someone, somewhere, held the power to move unseen among them. Trust eroded quickly. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. The invisible threat became the kingdom's greatest fear. But amidst the chaos, a glimmer of hope remained. The king knew that a quest to retrieve the cloak would require more than a mere soldier. It would require a hero of heart and courage, someone whose purity of spirit could resist the temptations of the cloak's power. And so, the search for such a hero began, while the kingdom braced itself for the dark days to come. Calyx, his once serene face lined with worry, prepared for a journey of his own. The cloak was gone, and with it, the fragile peace that had long protected Sylveron. The quest to retrieve it, however, was only just beginning. Word of the Cloak of Veils theft spread far and wide, carried on the wings of ravens and whispered by the wind to every corner of Sylveron. From the bustling cities to the quiet villages nestled in the rolling hills, the news ignited both fear and curiosity. Who could recover the cloak and restore balance to the kingdom? In the midst of this growing unrest, Calyx made his way to the royal palace, where the king had called for a council. The great hall buzzed with activity as noblemen and warriors from across the land gathered, each eager to prove themselves worthy of the quest. The king stood before them, his voice ringing with authority. "This is no ordinary task," the king declared, his gaze sweeping the room. "The cloak has fallen into dangerous hands, and the kingdom itself is at risk. We need a hero, someone who can face the perils of the journey and resist the dark temptations of the cloak's power. Step forward if you believe yourself worthy." One by one, warriors clad in gleaming armor stepped forward, mighty knights, seasoned generals, and those whose names were spoken with reverence in every tavern and court. Each boasted of their strength, courage, and cunning. Yet, as Calyx watched from the shadows, he felt a growing unease. These men, though brave and strong, were drawn by the cloak's power, not by the desire to protect the kingdom. They craved glory and reward, blinded by ambition. Then, amidst the throng, a figure stepped forward, a figure unlike any of the others. He was not a knight nor a lord, but a simple farmer, dressed in rough-spun clothes and worn boots. His name was Lysander. and though his hands bore the calluses of hard labor, there was something in his eyes that caught the wizard's attention. It was not pride or greed that shone there, but quiet determination. Lysander knelt before the king. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady though he was surrounded by warriors and noblemen. "I have no great title or sword to offer, but I have worked this land my whole life, and I love it with all my heart. I may not be a knight, but I will do whatever it takes to see that this kingdom is safe." A murmur ran through the hall, some in disbelief, others in amusement. What chance did a farmer have against an invisible thief and the dark magic that now threatened the kingdom? But Calyx felt the stirrings of hope. He saw something in Lysander that the others lacked, a purity of spirit, untouched by greed or hunger for power. The king, too, sensed something in the young man, something that set him apart from the warriors who had come before him. He stepped down from his throne, placing a hand on Lysander's shoulder. "You may not wear armor," the king said, "but your heart speaks louder than the finest sword. I believe you have the courage this kingdom needs." A hush fell over the hall as the king's words hung in the air. Calyx stepped forward then, his presence commanding attention. His long robes trailed behind him like shadows, and his eyes, though weary from the burden of the cloak's loss, gleamed with newfound purpose. "I see the truth in this young man," Calyx said, his voice soft yet powerful. "The cloak cannot be recovered by force or pride. It must be reclaimed by someone whose heart remains pure, untainted by the desire for its power. Lysander is the one we seek." Though many of the gathered knights and nobles grumbled with discontent, none dared challenge the wizard's wisdom. The king nodded in agreement and turned to Lysander. "You will not go alone," the king said. "Calyx will guide you, and the kingdom will support you in every way. This task will not be easy, but I believe in you." Lysander rose to his feet, overwhelmed but resolute. He had never imagined himself a hero, never dreamed that his life would take him beyond the fields he tilled each day. But now, with the weight of the kingdom's hopes upon him, he knew that his journey had already begun. The hall echoed with the sound of the king's blessing, and Lysander, humble yet determined, accepted the mantle of heroism thrust upon him. The simple farmer was no longer just a man of the earth. He was the one who would venture into the unknown, tasked with retrieving the stolen cloak and restoring peace to Sylveron. And so Lysander, with Calyx at his side, prepared to embark on a quest that would test not only his strength, but the purity of his soul. The fate of the kingdom now rested in the hands of the most unlikely of heroes. The day of Lysander's departure arrived, a crisp dawn breaking over Sylveron as golden light poured through the palace windows. Lysander stood at the gates, a small pack slung over his shoulder, his simple farmer's garb now accompanied by a sturdy leather vest gifted to him by the king. It was not armor, but it would protect him on his journey. Beside him, Calyx held a staff carved with ancient runes that shimmered faintly in the morning light. The wizard had given Lysander a map, its parchment worn with age, showing the winding paths of the land, leading through dark forests and across treacherous mountains. The destination was marked by a single, ominous symbol: the Mountain of Shadows, where Veric had fled with the Cloak of Veils. But the journey to that place would not be a straight path, for the lands between were wild and filled with dangers, both seen and unseen. "Lysander," Calyx said, his voice soft but firm, "this journey will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. Strength of arm will help you little. It is strength of heart that will see you through. Remember the purity of your purpose." "I will," Lysander replied, his voice steady, though his heart beat faster with each passing moment. The weight of his task pressed down on him, but he was resolute. The kingdom's peace, the lives of its people, depended on him. With the king's blessing and the eyes of the court upon him, Lysander set off with Calyx by his side. The road stretched long before them, winding through green fields and farmlands that soon gave way to dense forests. Birds called from the treetops, their songs a strange contrast to the tension that lay beneath the surface. Though the morning was calm, Lysander could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in around them. As they walked, Calyx began to speak of the journey ahead. "There are many trials you will face before we reach the Mountain of Shadows. The River of Mist lies ahead. Its waters have been enchanted for centuries, and it is said to disorient all who try to cross it without the guidance of magic." "Can your magic guide us through?" Lysander asked, though he already suspected the answer. "My magic may help," Calyx said, "but it will not be enough on its own. The river's enchantments are ancient, stronger than even I can control. We must rely on more than spells. The land itself tests the intentions of those who pass through it, and only those whose hearts are pure may find their way." Lysander nodded, though he felt a flicker of uncertainty. What did it mean to have a pure heart? He had always tried to be good, to do what was right, but was that enough? The weight of the cloak's power loomed large in his mind. How could one resist the temptation to use such a thing? To become invisible, to know all secrets, to move through the world unseen. It was a power that could change a man. But Lysander pushed these thoughts aside. He had been chosen not because he sought glory or power, but because he sought to protect what he loved. The land, the people, the peace of Sylveron. That was what mattered. As the sun climbed higher, they entered the forest of echoes. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches twisting together to form a thick canopy overhead, casting the forest floor in cool shadow. The air was still, but there was something unsettling about the quiet, too quiet. Even the birds had fallen silent. This forest is known for its illusions, Calyx warned. It will show you things from your past, things that haunt you. You must not believe everything you see. Lysander glanced around nervously as they continued deeper into the forest. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, but when he turned, there was nothing there. The silence grew heavier, like a thick fog settling over them. And then it began. At first, it was just a whisper, a soft voice calling his name drifting through the trees. Lysander paused, frowning. The voice was familiar, though distant, like an old memory stirred from a dream. Lysander. He turned to see a figure standing among the trees, half hidden in shadow. His heart skipped a beat. It was his father, a man long past, standing just beyond reach. His face as familiar as it was painful. Lysander's breath caught in his throat. "Father!" Lysander's voice trembled, but his feet remained planted on the path. He knew this couldn't be real, yet the image tugged at his heart, drawing him forward. The figure stretched out a hand, beckoning. "Come, Lysander, come home." Calyx placed a firm hand on Lysander's shoulder. "Do not follow," he whispered. "This is the forest's trick. Your heart knows the truth." Lysander's mind whirled, caught between memory and reality, but Calyx's words anchored him. He closed his eyes, steadying his breath. When he opened them again, the figure had vanished, replaced by the quiet rustling of the forest. They continued forward, the forest of illusions fading behind them, but the weight of the journey was only beginning to settle in. The river of mist awaited them just beyond the trees, and Lysander knew that greater challenges lay ahead. And so, with heart and spirit tested, Lysander pressed onward, his path uncertain, but his purpose clear. The journey to reclaim the Cloak of Veils had truly begun. The forest of echoes stretched deeper than Lysander had imagined. With each step, the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches curling like ancient fingers overhead, casting long shadows that danced in the fading light. The farther they ventured, the more the silence pressed down upon them, thick and eerie, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. "Stay close," Calyx whispered, his voice barely above the wind. "This is where the forest's magic grows strongest. It will try to confuse you, to twist your thoughts. Do not stray from the path." Lysander nodded, gripping the hilt of the small knife at his side, though he knew it was a poor defense against the powers at work here. His mind still lingered on the vision of his father, the familiar face that had almost drawn him into the forest's clutches. The echo of his father's voice haunted him, but Calyx's steady presence kept him grounded. As they moved deeper, the air grew heavier, as though the forest itself were watching them, waiting for its moment to strike. Lysander's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, every flicker of movement drawing his attention. Then, without warning, the whispers began again. At first they were faint, Soft voices carried on the wind, indistinct and ghostly. But soon they grew louder, closer, until the air was thick with murmurs. Lysander could hear his name repeated again and again, spoken by voices he recognized and voices he didn't. Lysander. Lysander, come back. The voices filled his head, overwhelming his thoughts. He could hear his mother, his childhood friends, even his neighbors from the village. They called to him with words of comfort and urgency, as though something terrible awaited him if he continued forward. His heart pounded in his chest, fear and doubt creeping into his mind. He turned to Calyx, who walked silently beside him, his eyes focused ahead. The wizard's face was calm, but his knuckles whitened on his staff, the only sign of the strain he was under. He had warned Lysander about the forest tricks, yet it was harder than he had imagined to resist the pull of those familiar voices. As the path narrowed, the trees thickened around them, and the whispers transformed into something more sinister. Shadows began to move at the corners of Lysander's vision, darting through the trees like fleeting figures. He glanced to his left and saw a boy, himself as he had been at 10 years old, running through the fields behind his village. And then the boy stumbled. Lysander watched as the younger version of himself fell to the ground, clutching his ankle. He remembered that day, the searing pain, the way he had called out for help, and how no one had come. He had been left alone, afraid. The boy on the path turned to Lysander, his eyes wide with fear. "Why didn't you save me?" the boy whispered, his voice trembling with accusation. Lysander's throat tightened. He wanted to reach out, to tell the boy that it wasn't real, that it had been a moment long past. But the pain of that memory lingered, and the guilt he had carried for so long surfaced like a wound reopened. "I didn't know," Lysander whispered to the vision, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know how." The boy's face twisted with sorrow, and the image began to fade. But the doubt it left behind weighed heavily on Lysander's heart. The forest had not only conjured the faces of his past, but had reached into his deepest fears, his regrets, and brought them to life. Calyx, sensing Lysander's struggle, stopped and turned to him. "Do not let the past weigh you down," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The forest preys on your doubts and fears. It will show you what you regret, but it cannot change what has been. You must look forward." Lysander nodded, though the weight of the forest's magic still pressed upon him. He took a deep breath and forced himself to focus on the path ahead. Slowly, the whispers began to fade, the shadows retreating into the depths of the trees. For a moment, it seemed as though they had passed through the worst of the forest's magic. The air grew lighter, and the path widened before them. But as they reached a clearing, a figure stepped from the shadows, blocking their way. It was a fox, its fur sleek and black as midnight. its eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. It regarded them with intelligence far beyond that of any ordinary creature. "Well met, travelers," the fox said, its voice smooth and knowing. "You have resisted the forest's illusions. Few are so lucky. But your journey is far from over." Lysander blinked in surprise. A talking fox was not something he had expected, though by now he had learned not to be surprised by anything in this enchanted forest. "Who are you?" Lysander asked, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his side. The fox sat back on its haunches, its tail curling around its paws. "I am called Sable," it said with a sly grin. "And I know what you seek. The cloak, yes? The thief you hunt is not far ahead, but the path to him is treacherous." Calyx stepped forward. "And why would you help us, Sable?" The fox's eyes gleamed with mischief. "Because I have a stake in this game, wizard. Varric's power grows with each passing day, and the balance of magic is being undone. If you are to succeed, you will need a guide through the darker paths of the forest." Lysander exchanged a glance with Calyx. The wizard's expression was unreadable, but Lysander could sense the wariness in his eyes. Yet, there was no time to doubt. The journey ahead was fraught with danger, and if Sable could guide them through, they had little choice but to trust him. With a final nod from Calyx, Lysander agreed. "Very well, Sable. Lead the way." And so, with their new guide in tow, Lysander and Calyx pressed deeper into the forest of echoes, the shadows of the past behind them, but the greater dangers still lying ahead. The quest for the Cloak of Veils was far from over, and the darkest trials were yet to come. The sun had long since dipped beneath the horizon by the time Lysander, Calyx, and their strange guide, Sable, emerged from the forest of echoes. The land that lay before them was stark and foreboding. A vast stretch of barren plains led to the looming silhouette of the Mountain of Shadows, its jagged peaks tearing into the darkening sky like claws. The mountain was bathed in an eerie twilight, the last glow of the sun casting long shadows across the rocky slopes. Sable, the black-furred fox, stood at the edge of the forest and gazed toward the mountain with narrowed eyes. "There it is," he said, his voice low. "Varric has made his refuge at the summit. It will not be an easy climb." Lysander felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the mountain's dark form. The wind howled around them, carrying with it the scent of cold stone and danger. The forest had been filled with illusions and shadows, but this mountain felt more solid, more real, and far more perilous. The ground beneath his feet seemed to vibrate with the very pulse of the earth, as if the mountain itself was alive, aware of their presence. "How far is it to the top?" Lysander asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Calyx, his expression grim, pointed to a narrow, winding path that snaked up the mountainside. It will take the better part of a day, perhaps longer, to reach the summit. But the journey is not just one of distance. The mountain is treacherous, and it is said to be alive with shadows, creatures born from darkness itself. Sable gave a knowing nod. The shadow beasts, he muttered. They guard Veric's stronghold. The mountain bends to his will now. You will need more than courage to face what lies ahead. Lysander's hand tightened on the hilt of his knife. He had never felt more unprepared for the task before him, but he had come too far to turn back now. His thoughts drifted to the kingdom of Sylveron, to the faces of the people who depended on him to restore peace, and to the Cloak of Veils, which remained in Veric's grasp, casting its dark influence across the land. With a deep breath, Lysander squared his shoulders. Then we have no time to lose. The climb began. The narrow path clung to the mountainside, a twisting and treacherous trail that seemed to shrink with every step. The air grew colder, biting at Lysander's skin, and the wind howled louder as if trying to push them back. Loose stones skittered beneath their feet, and more than once, Lysander had to catch himself from slipping. Beside him, Calyx walked with careful, deliberate steps, his staff tapping the ground ahead of them to test the way. Sable, nimble and light-footed, darted ahead, always staying just within sight. As they climbed higher, the mountain began to change. Shadows clung to the rocks, darker than they should have been in the fading light. They twisted and shifted, taking on strange forms that seemed to watch the trio as they moved. The shadows whispered like the forest, their voices low and menacing, filling Lysander's mind with doubts and fears. His grip tightened on the strap of his pack, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly the path widened into a narrow ledge, and there, blocking their way, stood a figure draped in shadows. Lysander's breath caught in his throat as he realized it wasn't just a figure. It was a creature. Its body was formed from darkness itself, a mass of swirling shadows with glowing red eyes that burned with malice. It was a shadow beast. The creature stepped forward, its form shifting and stretching as it moved. Its voice was a low growl, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Turn back!" it hissed. "None shall pass." Lysander's hand went to his knife, but before he could draw it, Calyx stepped forward, his staff raised high. "We do not fear shadows," the wizard said, his voice steady. "You will not bar our way." With a flick of his wrist, Calyx summoned a burst of light from his staff, a radiant glow that cut through the darkness like a beacon. The shadow beast recoiled, hissing and snarling as the light seared its form. But the shadows around them began to move as well, slithering from the rocks and gathering into more creatures, each one forming from the darkness itself. "There are too many," Sable warned, his sharp eyes darting between the creatures. "We must move quickly." Lysander's heart raced as more shadow beasts appeared, their glowing eyes narrowing on the intruders. He knew they couldn't fight them all, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. With the nod from Calyx, they pushed ahead, the wizard's light keeping the creatures at bay. But the path grew narrower and more perilous with every step. The mountain itself seemed to fight them, the wind whipping at their faces, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The higher they climbed, the more the shadows pressed in, and the more Lysander felt the weight of the task before him. Yet despite the danger, his resolve only grew stronger. He had come too far to turn back now. The summit was within sight, just beyond the swirling shadows that guarded it. And somewhere at the top, Varric waited, the Cloak of Veils in his grasp, ready to plunge the kingdom into chaos. The final battle was near, and Lysander knew that the fate of Sylveron rested in his hands. The summit of the Mountain of Shadows rose before Lysander, dark and foreboding, shrouded in swirling mist. The jagged rocks were like the teeth of some ancient beast, casting long shadows in the dim light. Varric was up there, hidden somewhere in the gloom, clutching the Cloak of Veils, and with it, the fate of Sylveron. Lysander, Calyx, and Sable reached the final stretch of the path, their breaths ragged from the climb. The shadow beasts, though relentless in their pursuit, had been held at bay by Calyx's light. But now, as they neared the top, the air thickened with magic, dark, suffocating magic that pressed down on them like a weight. "Varric knows we're here," Calyx said, his voice low. "Be prepared. His magic is strong, and the cloak only makes him more dangerous." Sable's fur bristled as he crouched low to the ground, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the summit ahead. "He'll use the shadows to his advantage. Keep your wits about you." Lysander nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest. The mountain had tested his strength, and the forest of echoes had tested his spirit. But this would test everything he had. He gripped his knife tightly, though he knew it would be of little use against Varric's dark magic. It would be courage, not steel, that would see him through this battle. As they reached the summit, the swirling mist parted, revealing a broad plateau of jagged stone. In the center of the clearing stood Varric, draped in the Cloak of Veils, his figure barely visible beneath the fabric that shimmered like moonlight. His face, pale and sharp, twisted into a cruel smile as he saw them approach. "So you've come," Varric said, his voice cold and mocking. "A farmer, a fox, and a wizard. I must say, I expected more from the kingdom's last hope." Lysander stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the cloak, the very air around it pulsing with power. "We've come to take back what you've stolen, Varric," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Varric's smile widened. "Stolen? No, boy. I've claimed what should have been mine all along. The cloak was never meant to sit in some dusty tower, guarded by a fool who doesn't understand its true power." Calyx raised his staff, the light at its tip flickering in the swirling darkness. You seek only power for yourself, Veric. The cloak was never meant for such greed. Veric laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed across the summit. Greed? You misunderstand me, wizard. Power is not something to be feared. It's something to be embraced, controlled. With the cloak, I will remake Sylveron in my image. None will stand in my way. As Veric spoke, the shadows around him seemed to grow thicker, darker, and suddenly he disappeared from view, the cloak rendering him invisible. The air grew still, thick with tension, and Lysander's heart raced. Veric could be anywhere, watching, waiting, ready to strike from the shadows. Calyx closed his eyes and muttered an incantation, his staff glowing brighter as he sent pulses of light out into the darkness, trying to reveal Veric's hidden form. But the cloak's magic was strong, stronger than even Calyx's spells could fully counter. The light flickered and faded, and the shadows crept back in. "Where is he?" Lysander whispered, his grip tightening on his knife as his eyes darted around the summit. Every shadow seemed to shift, every movement felt like a threat. Suddenly, Veric's voice rang out, echoing from all directions. "You cannot stop me! The cloak makes me invincible, invisible, more powerful than you could ever imagine." In a flash, Veric appeared behind Lysander, his hand raised, crackling with dark magic. Lysander barely had time to react before the blast of energy struck, sending him stumbling to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to his feet, determination burning in his chest. He couldn't let Veric win, not now. As Veric prepared to strike again, Lysander's eyes caught a glimmer of something in the shadows. Sable, the black fox, darting silently through the darkness, his keen eyes locked on Veric. In a swift, graceful leap, Sable lunged at Veric, his sharp teeth sinking into the fabric of the cloak. Veric let out a shout of rage, trying to shake the fox off, but Sable's grip held fast, tearing at the cloak. The sudden distraction gave Lysander the opening he needed. Summoning all his strength, he charged forward, his knife flashing in the dim light. In one swift motion, he struck at the cloak, slicing through the shimmering fabric. The cloak fell from Veric's shoulders, fluttering to the ground like a discarded shadow. For a moment, everything went still. Veric stood, now visible, his eyes wide with shock as the power of the cloak slipped from his grasp. Without the cloak's magic, he was vulnerable. Just a man, no longer the invincible figure he had believed himself to be. Lysander faced him, his knife still in hand, but he did not strike. He saw the fear in Veric's eyes, the realization that his reign of shadows had ended. Calyx stepped forward, his staff raised, ready to bind Veric's magic and ensure he could do no more harm. "You have lost, Veric," Calyx said softly, his voice filled with both sorrow and resolve. "The cloak's power is not yours to wield." Varric's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as the reality of his defeat settled in. The shadows that had once obeyed him began to dissipate, leaving the mountain silent once more. Lysander bent down and picked up the Cloak of Veils, its fabric cool and light in his hands. The weight of the kingdom's peace rested in that cloak, but so too did the temptation of its power. He felt the pull of it, the allure of what it could do, but he knew deep down that its true strength lay not in using it, but in protecting it from those who would. With the cloak safely in his grasp, Lysander turned to Calyx. "It's over." The wizard nodded, his face softening. "Yes, the balance is restored." And so, the battle was won, but the journey was not yet complete. The Cloak of Veils had been reclaimed, and with it, the future of Sylveron would once again shine bright. But Lysander, the farmer-turned-hero, knew that his true test had only just begun. The path back home awaited. The wind swept gently over the summit of the Mountain of Shadows as Lysander, still holding the Cloak of Veils in his hands, looked out over the vast kingdom of Sylveron spread beneath him. The once foreboding mountain now seemed calm, the swirling darkness that had threatened to consume the land slowly dissipating. Varric, defeated and bound by Calyx's magic, sat silently at the edge of the plateau, his eyes downcast, his arrogance drained away. For a moment, there was nothing but quiet, the kind of silence that followed after a storm had passed. Lysander felt the weight of the cloak in his hands, not its physical heaviness, but the burden it carried. This was more than just a piece of cloth. It was a relic of power, a symbol of trust, and a force that could alter the world in the wrong hands. As he stared at its shimmering threads, he knew that it could never be used for personal gain. Its magic, though tempting, was meant to protect, not control. Calyx stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Lysander's shoulder. "You've done well, Lysander. The kingdom owes you more than you know." Lysander turned to the wizard, a question lingering in his mind. "How will we keep this from happening again? Varric's not the only one who could desire the cloak. There will be others, won't there?" Calyx nodded, his expression grave but wise. "Yes, there will always be those drawn to its power. That is why the cloak must be hidden once more, kept safe by those who understand its true purpose." The wizard's eyes softened as he looked at Lysander. "And that is why it must be returned to the tower, where its magic can be protected from those who seek to abuse it." Sable, the black fox who had guided them through the forest of echoes and fought bravely alongside them, approached with a knowing gleam in his eyes. "A wise decision," he said, his voice sly but approving. "The balance of the land must be preserved, and the cloak must remain a secret, known only to a trusted few." Lysander nodded. The journey had tested him in ways he had never imagined. He had faced not only physical danger, but the temptations of power, the shadows of his past, and the doubt in his heart. Yet, through it all, he had remained true to his purpose. And now, as the cloak's shimmering fabric lay in his hands, he felt a quiet strength growing within him. The climb down the mountain was slow and steady, the once threatening path now feeling lighter, as if the mountain itself had been relieved of its dark burden. The sun began to rise as they descended, casting the land in hues of gold and pink. The kingdom below stirred with life once more, unaware of the battle that had taken place at the mountain's peak, but ready to welcome the peace that followed. When they reached the foot of the mountain, Lysander paused for a moment, looking back at the towering peak behind them. The journey had been long, filled with trials he had never expected, and yet he had survived. He had done more than that. He had protected his home, his people, and the balance of magic in the land. Calyx stood beside him, his eyes thoughtful. "You've proven yourself beyond what any of us could have imagined, Lysander. You've done more than retrieve the cloak. You've restored hope." Lysander glanced down at the cloak in his arms, the fabric still shimmering softly. "I'm just a farmer," he said, his voice humble. "I never thought I could do something like this." The wizard smiled. It is often the ones who least expect greatness who rise to the occasion. The kingdom will remember your courage, even if they never know the full story of what happened here. They continued their journey, passing through the quiet villages and peaceful fields that now seemed brighter, untouched by the darkness that had threatened them. Word of their return spread quickly, though few knew the full extent of Lysander's quest. To the people, he was simply a humble man who had gone on a journey with the wizard. But to those who truly understood, Lysander was the hero who had saved Sylveron. At last, they reached the tower where the cloak would once again be hidden away, protected by Calyx and the ancient spells that guarded it. Lysander stood at the threshold of the tower, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the end of his journey, but also the beginning of something new. As he handed the cloak back to Calyx, Lysander felt a deep sense of peace. The power that had once threatened to consume the kingdom was now safe, and the balance had been restored. "Will you stay?" Calyx asked, his voice gentle. "There is a place for you here if you wish it." Lysander smiled, but he shook his head. "Thank you, but no. I belong with my people, with the land. There's work to be done, crops to tend, and a simple life that waits for me. That's where I'm meant to be." Calyx nodded, understanding. "Then go with my blessing, Lysander. Sylveron will always owe you a great debt." With a final farewell, Lysander turned and began the journey home. The road stretched long before him, but this time it did not seem so daunting. The hero of Sylveron was returning not to a life of glory, but to the simple, peaceful life he had always known. A life richer now, with the knowledge that even the humblest of souls could change the fate of the kingdom. And so, the Cloak of Veils was returned to its rightful place, hidden away until it was needed again. And Lysander's story became a quiet legend, whispered by firesides and told to those who sought to understand the true meaning of courage.